A few hours later, police, accompanied by SWAT, arrived at the address. The front yard looked abandoned and desolate, with the first-floor windows covered by tattered curtains and no light visible inside. SWAT rushed inside, desperately hoping to find the victim alive, possibly tied up and imprisoned somewhere in the building. Methodically moving from room to room, officers found numerous items that instantly connected to the victim's property. Blood spatter could be seen on various parts of the walls and floor, clearly indicating signs of violence. Investigators also found a knife with dried bloodstains, along with torn fragments of bloody women's clothing scattered throughout the house. However, the most tragic discovery was in a trash can in the corner. Under dirty sheets and rags, police uncovered the lifeless body of a woman. The sight was so harrowing that even seasoned homicide detectives were shaken. Today, we will take an in-depth look at one of the most high-profile and violent tragedies in modern U.S. history, a case that continues to evoke shock and sorrow even years later. This heartbreaking story is not merely another tragic chapter in the nation's history of violent crime. It stands out because of the unimaginable brutality inflicted on two promising young men who unknowingly became targets of ruthless assailants. The case's notoriety stems not only from the heinous acts committed, but also from the extensive media coverage, the community's reaction, and the complex legal proceedings that ensued in the aftermath. At the core of this harrowing tale lies an unfathomable situation involving two completely innocent victims and 5 merciless criminals. The motive behind this heinous act was shockingly simple: a robbery that took a tragic, barbaric turn. Yet many remain puzzled by how a basic intent to steal could escalate into such an extreme show of cruelty and violence. Within the tangled web of events that unfolded, numerous questions emerged. Could the perpetrator's actions have been prevented at any stage by timely intervention? Were there signs that were overlooked or warnings that went unheeded? And was there any opportunity for the victims to escape or for law enforcement to have intervened in time? To answer these troubling questions, we must delve deeply into the specifics of the case, assembling the timeline of the horrific events, examining the role each perpetrator played, and exploring the ultimate question of whether this tragedy could have been avoided, potentially saving 2 bright young lives. At times, these details are almost too painful to absorb, but they are essential for understanding the gravity of the case and honoring the memory of those who lost their futures in a senseless act of violence. Shannon Christian was born on April 29, 1985, in Nacogdoches, Texas. She was the younger of 2 children in a tight-knit family led by Dina and Gary Christian. In 1997, the Christian family relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee, seeking new opportunities and a more stable environment. Shannon, who had inherited her mother's keen interest in psychology, grew fascinated by the idea of helping people in crisis, reflecting her compassionate upbringing. As a teen, Shannon was outgoing and kind to everyone she met. She was also working part-time to save money for a personal goal she had dreamed of for years, buying her very own car. Recognizing her unwavering determination and wanting to reward her for her diligence, her parents and brother combined their resources to make her dream come true. On her 21st birthday, they surprised her by contributing funds toward the purchase of a silver Toyota, a car that she cherished both as a symbol of independence and as a milestone of entering adulthood. Christopher Newsom, universally known among friends and family as Chris, was born on September 21, 1983 in Knoxville, Tennessee, to Mary and Hugh Newsom. He grew up in a large, loving family, enjoying the warmth and protection of doting parents, grandparents, and older siblings. From a young age, Chris excelled athletically, finding his stride in baseball during his school years. Coaches praised his agility and unwavering focus on the field, with one mentor predicting he had a real shot at playing the sport professionally someday. Tragically, a severe injury sidelined him. He required prolonged recovery, extensive physical therapy, and a grueling mental adjustment to accept that his dream of a future in baseball might no longer be within reach. Nonetheless, Chris proved resilient, channeling his energy into various hobbies and discovering new talents. Although he once harbored the ambition of becoming a mechanic, Chris ultimately found himself more drawn to carpentry as a possible vocation. After finishing high school, he enrolled at the University of Tennessee, known for both its academic rigor and spirited campus life, where he consistently ranked among the top of his class. His diligence and innate curiosity earned him a reputation for being an enthusiastic and open-minded learner. It was on the university campus in 2006 that Chris and Shannon first crossed paths, meeting through a circle of mutual friends. Shannon was just 21, and Chris was approaching his 23rd birthday. From the instant they met, those who witnessed their introduction sensed an immediate spark. Before long, the two became inseparable, spending nearly every spare moment together. Within just a month of dating, Chris, brimming with pride and excitement, introduced Shannon to his parents, confiding that he saw a future with this caring, intelligent young woman. Moved by his sincerity and gentle spirit, Shannon soon followed suit, bringing Chris home to meet her mother, father, and brother. The Christian family welcomed Chris warmly, delighted to see Shannon so happy and secure. On January 6, 2007, Shannon Christian, whose name was often spelled as Shannon by close friends and relatives, and Christopher Newsom were invited to a birthday party being thrown by a mutual friend. The celebration promised to be a cheerful gathering, with acquaintances from the university and beyond eager to toast the occasion. That Saturday morning, Shannon headed to a local beauty salon for some final touches before the evening event, excited to show off a fresh look. She parked her cherished silver Toyota in a nearby underground garage, which is where the couple agreed to meet so that they could drive together to the party. However, Chris was delayed, caught in an unexpected traffic jam after running errands. Time was ticking, and Shannon grew anxious as she hated to be late for social commitments, particularly one involving close friends. A slight argument ensued between the couple over the phone, with Shannon expressing frustration that they might miss out on a portion of the festivities. Nevertheless, both seemed intent on quickly resolving their disagreement and still making an appearance at the party. By the time the celebration was already underway, Shannon and Chris had not arrived, which sparked immediate concern among those who knew them well. The couple was widely recognized for their responsibility and courteous nature. It was unlike them to simply miss an event without providing any explanation or notification. Alarmed, friends tried calling and texting both Shannon and Chris, only to be met with silence. The group grew increasingly uneasy, fearing that some unforeseen mishap might have occurred. Attempts to reach Shannon and Chris on their phones that night proved frustratingly unsuccessful. The situation quickly escalated from mild concern to deep worry. In desperation, Shannon's best friend repeatedly called Shannon's mother, Dina, late into the evening, hoping for an update or some reassurance that everything was all right. But each time, there was no response. The sense of helplessness grew with each unanswered call, and an unsettling feeling that something was amiss began to take hold. By the next morning, Dina woke to discover that her daughter still had not come home. Although this realization was alarming, she initially tried to comfort herself with rational explanations. Perhaps Shannon had decided to stay overnight at Chris's apartment after the party, which was not an entirely unusual occurrence. Since Shannon had a scheduled work shift on Sunday, it seemed plausible that she might have gone straight to her job from Chris's place, especially if they had stayed out late celebrating with friends. But Dina's calm facade quickly unraveled when she scrolled through her missed calls from the night before and noticed multiple attempts to reach her from an unfamiliar phone number. Returning the call, Dina was greeted by the anxious voice of Shannon's best friend, who explained that neither Shannon nor Chris had shown up at the birthday party, a fact which was highly out of character for both of them. On top of that, they were completely unreachable. No texts, no calls, and no posts on social media. Immediately, Dina's heart sank, and a sickening certainty set in, as though she could sense that something terrible had occurred. The dread only deepened with each passing minute of silence. Meanwhile, Chris's parents were dealing with the same unnerving mystery. They too had thought that their son might be spending time at Shannon's place, perhaps relaxing together before Sunday obligations. As the hours passed, they tried calling his phone, only to be met with an unbroken ringtone and no personal response. They soon discovered that Shannon had not shown up for work that day either, an unmistakable red flag for someone as diligent and reliable as she was. The parents of both young adults quickly agreed that something was gravely wrong. Worried beyond measure, they reached out to the police, hoping for an immediate and robust response. To their dismay, the reaction was lackluster. An officer casually suggested that Shannon and Chris might have chosen to spend some extra time alone, losing track of the clock and ignoring their phones in the process. Additionally, there was the familiar refrain. The department's protocol indicated that an adult was typically not considered missing for at least 24 hours without contact. Despite Dina and the Newsomes pleading for assistance, the authorities seemed reluctant to dedicate urgent resources to the case. This was a devastating blow, as every lost moment felt like an eternity. For Shannon and Chris, those 24 hours would prove to be critical in ways that no one could have fully anticipated. Refusing to remain idle, the parents, close friends, and extended networks of the young couple launched their own informal search operations. They doggedly called everyone they could think of, including classmates, colleagues, and neighbors who might know the couple's whereabouts or last movements. They combed through local hospitals in the hope that an accident victim matching Chris or Shannon's description might have been admitted. Despite this flurry of activity, no useful information surfaced about where Shannon or Chris could have gone. Friends and acquaintances who had seen Shannon at the beauty salon on Saturday offered only a few details. The hairstylist mentioned that Shannon had been eagerly discussing the birthday party and seemed in a rush to make it there on time. She gave no indication of any additional errands or stops in her plans. This left the parents and friends in the dark as to what could have transpired between the salon appointment and the moment the couple seemingly vanished. By the time Monday, January 8th arrived, law enforcement finally stepped up its role, starting a formal search for the missing duo. Officers conducted interviews, requested surveillance footage from businesses, and began collecting statements from anyone who might have encountered the couple. However, the slow initial response meant that a crucial window of time had already been lost. Still, thanks to the tireless efforts of Shannon and Chris's families and friends, much of Knoxville and its neighboring communities had become aware of the couple's disappearance. Everyone from local TV stations to college bulletin boards displayed their photos, urging the public to call police or a designated tip line with any hint or lead. The day before, on Sunday, the city's rumor mill had started humming with disturbing chatter about a grisly discovery near some railroad tracks. Nothing had been confirmed, and the authorities were tight-lipped, but stories circulated that a railroad worker had stumbled upon badly damaged human remains. At first, many assumed it must be an unrelated tragedy, perhaps a lone victim struck by a train or attacked by unknown assailants. Nevertheless, word spread quickly, and people began to fear that this horrifying find might be connected to Shannon and Chris's inexplicable disappearance. As it turned out, those rumors were not unfounded. The railroad worker, completing his routine inspection of the tracks, had been horrified to discover what appeared to be a human body lying in an embankment along the railway. The remains were in an unspeakable state, bearing multiple injuries and signs of a deliberate attempt at burning, as if the perpetrator or perpetrators had tried to obliterate evidence or conceal the victim's identity. The worker immediately reported the gruesome scene, prompting local law enforcement to rush in and cordon off the area. Investigators photographed every inch of the scene, searching desperately for significant clues like discarded materials, footprints, shell casings, or any other physical evidence that might link a suspect to this heinous act. Once they completed preliminary documentation, the officers had the remains transported to the morgue for a thorough autopsy. The goal was to determine both the cause of death and any identifying characteristics that might match a recently reported missing person. However, the extent of the damage, caused by severe trauma and the attempted burning, suggested that identification would be extremely challenging. Criminalists, forensic pathologists, and investigators braced themselves for the likelihood of a long, painstaking process, including the possibility of using dental records if any teeth remained intact, or even advanced DNA testing. Despite these obstacles, forensic experts were able to confirm several harrowing details about the victim's final hours. First, the body belonged to a young man who had suffered a brutally violent death. The presence of numerous injuries, many of them inflicted while he was still alive, led investigators to conclude that the killing had been both prolonged and sadistic in nature. Shockingly, almost all of his teeth had been knocked out or badly damaged, an indication of either extreme physical assault or an effort to obscure his identity. The autopsy revealed that he had been shot 3 times, twice in the back and once in the head. A final fatal shot. To add to the sheer horror, forensic testing detected seminal fluid from at least 3 different men within the victim's body, as well as lacerations and tears consistent with repeated sexual assault. The level of brutality was almost unfathomable, even to seasoned investigators who had seen their fair share of homicides. Given that the police were reviewing reports of missing young men, it did not take long for them to note the strong similarity between the victim's approximate age, height, and build, and the description provided for Christopher Newsom. Still, they needed more concrete proof. They reached out to Chris's parents, explaining the grim discovery and requesting DNA samples for comparison. Although they could not say with total certainty that the body was indeed Chris, the police made it painfully clear that the evidence strongly suggested a match. To spare Mary and Hugh Newsom a deeply traumatic experience, the officers advised them against coming to the morgue for a visual identification, since the charred and disfigured remains barely resembled human features at all. The final identification would depend on scientific methods rather than a direct viewing. Unfortunately, the DNA analysis confirmed beyond doubt that the remains found near the railroad tracks belonged to the missing student, Christopher Newsom. Forensic examiners performed multiple tests on the severely damaged body, comparing DNA samples gathered from Chris's personal items and from cheek swabs provided by his parents. This conclusive result delivered a devastating blow to the Newsom family and stunned those who had still held on to the belief that perhaps, by some miracle, Chris might be found alive and rescued from wherever he had vanished. Grief overwhelmed the household, with relatives and close friends arriving to comfort Chris's parents, who now had to endure the unimaginable reality that their beloved son had been brutally murdered. Despite this horrifying confirmation about Christopher's fate, Shannon Christian's parents, Dina and Gary Christian, continued to cling to the waning hope that their daughter was still alive. They refused to consider the possibility that she too might have fallen victim to the same gruesome end. Their resolve was bolstered by a small but significant clue. Shannon's mobile phone had last been pinged on the day she and Chris disappeared, in one of Knoxville's more troubled neighborhoods, an area with a higher crime rate and a reputation for illicit activity. This location was a place Shannon and Chris would have had no reason to visit under normal circumstances, reinforcing the theory that they were taken there against their will. Believing that Shannon could be held captive nearby, the Christians urged law enforcement to pursue every possible lead in that part of town. Their fervent hope was that she might still be alive and hidden in an abandoned building, basement, or other makeshift location until someone, perhaps the authorities, found the right tip or stumbled upon the correct address. They prayed that time had not run out and that somehow Shannon could still be saved. In a secluded alley of this very neighborhood, investigators discovered Shannon's Toyota SUV abandoned in a state of utter disrepair. When her parents were notified of the discovery and shown the vehicle, they scarcely recognized it as their daughter's car. The once shiny exterior was now filthy and covered in scratches, with broken headlights and deflated tires. Inside, the scene was equally distressing. All of Shannon's personal belongings were gone, and the interior reeked of cigarette smoke. Cigarette butts lay strewn across the floor. The seats were torn and stained, and there was a general air of wanton vandalism throughout. Even the steering wheel bore scratch marks and embedded grime, as though a group of strangers had used the car with reckless abandon. One noticeable detail caught the investigators' attention. The driver's seat had been pushed so far back that it suggested a large adult male might have been the last person to operate the SUV. A crucial piece of evidence emerged in the form of a crumpled envelope lying on the floor between the front seats. Upon closer examination, the detectives noted that it bore an address on Chipman Street, just a few blocks away from where the car had been left. It seemed likely that the envelope had been dropped or accidentally left behind by one of the perpetrators, someone perhaps careless or in a hurry to vacate the vehicle. Following this lead, the police began questioning local residents who might have seen Shannon's SUV driving through the area. A local witness recalled that on that fateful Saturday evening, he had seen 4 African-American males riding in a silver SUV that looked out of place in that part of town. When the authorities lifted fingerprints off the envelope, they discovered a match to Lamarcus Davidson, an individual with a serious criminal history who had been previously convicted for violent offenses. This match quickly elevated Davidson to a prime suspect. Investigators soon learned that he resided in a house situated in an industrial zone, adjacent to a vacant lot often used for illegal dumping. The property had a reputation for frequent comings and goings of unfamiliar people, and the neighbors had occasionally reported disturbances or loud noises emanating from the place. Within hours, the police, accompanied by a tactical team, converged on Davidson's listed address. The front yard appeared desolate. The windows on the ground floor were covered with shabby curtains, and no lights were visible inside. Knocking on the door produced no response. Officers announced their presence and gave repeated warnings, urging anyone inside to come out peacefully. Met with silence, they forced entry, hoping against hope to find Shannon alive, possibly bound and imprisoned somewhere in the building. Although they were prepared for a hostile confrontation, the interior was eerily quiet. Moving methodically from room to room, the officers discovered numerous items that instantly connected the property to both Shannon and Chris. First, they found Shannon's purse, partially emptied, lying in a corner. A stuffed toy that Shannon kept in her car for good luck was tossed onto a dirty mattress in one of the rooms. The fact that these personal effects were inside the house suggested a terrifying scenario in which both students had been brought there against their will. Additional items, including Christopher's headphones and his beloved baseball cap, lay on a table, chillingly solidifying the connection to the missing couple. Blood spatters were visible in various spots on the walls and floor, indicating signs of violent activity. Investigators also came upon a knife with dried blood traces, as well as torn fragments of blood-stained women's clothing, scattered in different parts of the house. However, the most tragic find was in the trash can that stood in the corner. Underneath dirty sheets and rags, the police uncovered Shannon Christian's lifeless body, wrapped in 5 separate trash bags and bound in the fetal position. The sight proved gut-wrenching, even for seasoned homicide detectives. Every inch of the scene spoke of extreme brutality, painting a nightmarish picture of what Shannon must have endured. Forensic experts examined her remains and estimated that she had likely passed away in the early hours of Monday, January 8th, just 2 days after her sudden disappearance. The condition of Shannon's body was so appalling that even veteran forensic specialists were shaken. Not a single area of her skin had been spared from the onslaught. She was covered with bruises, abrasions, cuts, and cigarette burns. She had numerous lacerations in the genital area and signs of violence, as well as injuries to her mouth and throat, indicating repeated violations by several individuals. Shannon had also sustained a severe head injury likely inflicted by blunt force, as well as internal bleeding in her abdomen, consistent with violent kicking or stomping. Moreover, the assailants had subjected her to multiple stab wounds, although none were immediately fatal, and had extinguished dozens of cigarettes on her body, compounding her suffering. In one of the most disturbing aspects of this brutal crime, the perpetrators had attempted to destroy or obscure DNA evidence by dousing Shannon in household bleach, focusing in particular on her open wounds and genital areas. They also forced her to ingest bleach, an act of sheer cruelty evidently aimed at eliminating any traces that might link them to the crime. Ultimately, in an almost incomprehensible act of barbarity, Shannon, still alive at the time, was wrapped in 5 trash bags and shoved into the trash chute, buried beneath soiled linens and rags. Unable to free herself or cry out for help, she died slowly from suffocation and blood loss, a fate that underlined the heartbreaking reality that each minute mattered in the early stages of her disappearance. In the aftermath of this ghastly discovery, the property's occupant, Lamarcus Davidson, in whose home Shannon's mutilated body and Chris's personal effects were found, was labeled an immediate fugitive. A multi-agency manhunt began, with state and local law enforcement agencies pooling resources to locate Davidson before he could flee the region or inflict harm on anyone else. At the same time, investigators identified another suspect named Eric Boyd, after detecting his traces at the crime scene and in conversations with potential witnesses. Boyd was apprehended on January 11th without any serious resistance. Once in custody, he wasted no time in distancing himself from the more egregious aspects of the crime. He claimed, in a bid to secure a plea deal or leniency, that he did not want to go to prison for crimes he didn't commit. Under intense questioning, Boyd admitted to knowing where Lamarcus Davidson was hiding. According to Boyd, Davidson had taken refuge in a vacant home, one that was listed for sale and therefore unoccupied, making it a convenient makeshift hideout. Boyd himself led the police to the property, guiding them through back streets and quiet neighborhoods until they reached the house in question. When the SWAT team and detectives converged on the vacant residence, Davidson was caught entirely off guard. With no apparent plan for a confrontation and seemingly no place to run, he offered no resistance upon arrest. Officers handcuffed him on the spot, quickly reading him his rights and ensuring he was isolated from the public. The tension in the air was palpable, as the capture of Davidson brought both a sense of relief and a fresh wave of anguish for Shannon and Chris's families, who now had to grapple with the tragic conclusion of their search. By detaining Davidson and Boyd, the authorities hoped to untangle the full extent of the crime, identify any remaining suspects, and build a case strong enough to deliver justice for Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Notably, at the moment of his arrest, Lamarcus Davidson was found wearing sneakers that had belonged to the very student he was accused of murdering. This detail became another proof of his involvement in the kidnapping and assault of a married couple. It also added yet another layer of horror to an already appalling sequence of events, illustrating the brazen manner in which he retained items belonging to his victims. During the initial rounds of police interrogations, Davidson attempted to downplay his role, claiming that he was neither responsible for the murder nor the torture. Instead, he painted himself as a reluctant witness who had somehow been swept up in the crimes by dangerous associates. According to Davidson, the couple had allegedly come to his residence to purchase banned substances, implying that Shannon and Chris were partly to blame for their own tragic fate. Davidson insisted that a conflict erupted between them and his acquaintances, leading to violence that he supposedly wanted nothing to do with. He maintained that he fled the scene to avoid witnessing or participating in the brutality. However, as interrogations continued, 3 additional suspects emerged: George Thomas, a friend of Davidson's; Latalvis Cobbins, Davidson's half-brother, and an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa Lynn Coleman. In total, 5 suspects were implicated in the disappearance and murder of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Law enforcement placed them all in separate holding cells for individual interrogations, ensuring that none of them could coordinate stories to obscure the truth, as each suspect tried to shift blame onto someone else, fearing the harshest penalties. They accidentally revealed crucial parts of the overall narrative. Police investigators meticulously gathered these fragments, sorting out the chronology of events and reconstructing every perpetrator's role in the crimes.
She asked me what's going on. I said, I don't know. She asked me where her boyfriend is. I said, I don't know. She asked me, why were we doing this? I told her, it's not me. It's not me. It's not me. I don't have anything to do with this. Matter of fact, we're being held here against our will just like you are. The only difference is that you're tied up and we're not.
A timeline of tragic events. Lamarcus Davidson, born in 1981, had been released on parole just a few months prior to these atrocities, after serving time for previous violent offenses. By the winter of 2007, he was in dire need of money to finance his illegal activities, especially since he needed a vehicle to deliver illegal substances to his clients. Lacking any financial stability, Davidson formulated a plan to steal a car from an underground parking garage, rumored to have minimal security and no functioning surveillance cameras. It was under these unfortunate circumstances that Davidson and at least one accomplice wound up in the same location as Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, who were in the garage arguing over Chris's late arrival. This chance encounter proved to be a deadly twist of fate. Seeing that both students were vulnerable and that their car could serve his immediate need, Davidson made the chilling decision to leave no witnesses. Armed with a handgun, he and his accomplice forced Shannon and Chris into the trunk at gunpoint. From that moment, the victims' plight turned into a nightmare from which they would not escape. The perpetrators drove the couple to Davidson's house, where the students were beaten and subjected to repeated assaults. Investigators pieced together details suggesting that this initial brutality included physical attacks, forced sexual acts, and the unrelenting terror of being held captive in an unfamiliar home. Many of these details came out only later, during the suspects' fragmented confessions, and left even seasoned detectives stunned by the cruelty involved. Sometime after midnight, the suspects turned their attention to Christopher. Barefoot and stripped of clothing, he was again shoved into a vehicle trunk and driven to the nearby railroad tracks. There, under the cover of darkness, the perpetrators forced him to walk on the hard stones, likely to disorient him further or to inflict additional suffering. Without hesitation, they shot him twice in the back, leaving him gravely wounded on the ground. In a final act of brutality, they fired a fatal shot to his head, ending his life. Then, in an attempt to erase evidence that might tie them to the murder, they doused Christopher's body with a flammable liquid and set him on fire, hoping to destroy any physical clues that could link them to the crime scene. Having committed this shocking act, the criminals returned to the house, where Shannon remained bound and completely at their mercy. Over the next day, she was subjected to repeated unimaginable cruelty, a prolonged assault so savage that, according to forensic reports, no part of her body was left uninjured. The perpetrators eventually used household bleach to wash her body, a sinister effort to eliminate DNA evidence of the assaults. Although the legal proceedings for each suspect unfolded with slight variations, the central conclusion remained consistent. The actions of Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Eric Boyd, and Vanessa Coleman represented one of the most shocking and vicious crimes in recent memory. In the end, every piece of DNA evidence, physical traces, witness statements, and confessions led back to these 5 individuals, dismantling their claims of innocence or marginal involvement. The court issued a verdict ranging from life to death.
What is the decision of the jury as to what the punishment should be with regard to those counts?
The punishment is death.